agreement, much higher than you would expect by chance. Casey's rating of what he's like now versus his mother's rating of what he was like before, again, levels of agreement falls down to chance. Casey doesn't necessarily have much appreciation that his personality has changed, but he does have an appreciation of what he's like as a person. Casey has a fair amount of semantic self-knowledge, even though he is utterly lacking when it comes to episodic self-knowledge. And the fact that amnesia can dissociate semantic and episodic self-knowledge in this way suggests that episodic and semantic self-knowledge represented independently in memory. You can lose access to one, but retain access to the other. Endel Tolvien's work on patient KC inspired Klein and his colleagues. Stan Klein was my student when I taught at Harvard. That's one of the reasons you get a lot of Stan Klein. He just does wonderful work. Has nothing to do with me. But he did involve me in this particular study. When you do work in amnesia, you usually have a little kit of tests that you could go off and give on a moment's notice. And Klein had one of these. And in the course of his teaching, he stumbled upon a case of a student who had a temporary retrograde amnesia, and this became the case of WJ, because those aren't her initials. Okay, she was an 18-year-old college undergraduate. She was, in fact, a freshman in the second quarter of her freshman year. And in the course of some vigorous activity in her room, she fell out of bed and sustained a concussive blow to the head that rendered her amnesic. As often happens in these cases, she experienced an anterograde amnesia, which means that she has basically no memory for anything that she did. She was conscious, but she has no memory for anything that she did for about 45 minutes after the injury. That's the anterograde component of her amnesia. But interestingly, she also suffered a temporally graded retrograde amnesia. She was completely amnesic for the events of her life covering the previous 6 or 7 months. Now, this is an absolutely fascinating feature that you often encounter with traumatic retrograde amnesia, which is if you're doing the calculation, this happened to her in the middle of her second quarter of her freshman year, February, March, so, okay. Then she had retrograde amnesia to 6 or 7 months. Her amnesia basically went all the way back to high school graduation. She could remember things from before high school graduation, but she couldn't remember anything that happened between high school graduation and now. This temporal boundary to retrograde amnesia occurs quite often, even in cases of brain damage. I remember a particular case of a guy who was rendered amnesic because he grabbed a high-tension wire. He's lucky that the amnesia is all that happened to him. And it knocked out all of his memories back to his wedding day. You remember everything up to his wedding day. After his wedding day, it was all gone, right? He got it back later. You get recovery from these retrograde amnesias, and the amnesia cleared in 11 days. But for those 11 days, WJ was not able to remember anything that she had done for the previous 6 or 7 months. As I say, Klein was ready for this. He had a little kit of memory tests to do. So when he found out about the case, he got permission WJ's permission, in fact, to test her and gave her a bunch of things. This is just a nice documentation of her retrograde amnesia. This is a procedure known as the Krovitz-Robinson technique. Do I have this here? Yeah, the Galton Cube recall technique. It's an alternative name for it. Where what you do is you present a noun or a verb or an adjective or something like that, and then you simply ask the person to remember an event that is related to that word. So you put up automobile, and you say, oh, I remember that I was almost in an accident in the rain yesterday, or something like that. Okay. So in any event, what Klein did was to present these items to these cues to WJ, asking her to remember an event from her own life that's related to the cue word, and then also Klein repeated this with a group of control subjects. These were other 18-year-old college freshmen, basically same age and college status as WJ. And what you see here is the proportion of memories that came from various periods in people's lives. The control subjects in dark blue show you the typical gradient of autobiographical memory. If you ask people to remember the things that they've done, they usually remember things from the very recent past. This is the last 12 months. And then memory kind of falls off. There's a nice temporal gradient to that. But WJ showed exactly the reverse pattern. She had almost no memories from dated within the last 12 months. Remember, she was amnesic for the previous 6 or 7 months. And most of her memories were from the most remote past. That's a very nice documentation of her retrograde amnesia. This is what she looked like 11 days later after she recovered her memories. There is recovery from traumatic retrograde amnesia. And here, the performance of WJ is essentially indistinguishable from the performance of the controls. So for 11 days, especially for the first part of those 11 days, she was amnesic for anything that she had done over the past 6 or 7 months. So what Klein then did was to ask her kind of what she's been like during that time, to look at semantic self-knowledge. Some of you may have noticed that when you come to college, it changes you. All right? You don't just get smarter, you don't just learn physical chemistry or whatever it is you're taking in school, but the experience of being away from home, being with new people, being in a new environment will actually have an effect on changing your personality. And in fact, most students, when they come to college, do experience various kinds of personality changes. So it's a perfectly reasonable thing to expect that WJ's own personality would have changed by virtue of her first half a year or so in college. And the question is, would she have any idea about that? So Klein did essentially what Tolvien did, gave WJ an adjective checklist just to describe herself. And as a check, instead of where Tolvien relied on Casey's mother as a check, Klein went to WJ's boyfriend. Okay, said, what you like? Okay, and what you got was pretty good agreement, a correlation of 0.65 between WJ's ratings of herself and her boyfriend's ratings of what she's like. When you did this with the control college women, asked them to rate themselves, and then went out and surveyed their boyfriends. They all had boyfriends. Okay, you got the same amount of agreement. So it seems that WJ knew what she was like now, despite the fact that she couldn't remember anything that she had done for the past 6 or 7 months. Klein also asked WJ to rate what she was like in high school and compared that to her ratings of what she was like in college. There is some correlation there. You're not changed entirely. You don't become an entirely different species. Well, some people do when you get to college. So there's some relation between her current personality and her high school personality. Okay, but when you look at her test retest reliability, if you ask WJ to rate what she's like now on a couple of different occasions, again you see very high correlation. So her self-knowledge is reliable, basically the same amount of reliability as you get in the controls. And WJ's knowledge of what she was like then does not account for her knowledge about what she's like now. These two correlations are significantly different from each other. So again, what we've got here is a second instance where you have episodic and semantic memory about the self, episodic and semantic self-knowledge dissociated in cases of amnesia. Amnesic patients retain some idea about what they're like in general, what their personalities are like, even if they can't remember any of the events in which they displayed those particular traits. Okay, so there you go. That's the general idea here. Amnesics retain knowledge of their personalities, even if they forget knowledge of events, and that confirms the findings from the priming studies that the trait and behavioral, episodic and semantic self-knowledge seem to be represented independently in memory. Now, Klein and his colleagues have done a couple of other cases like this. I'll actually skip over this because there's something else I want to point out here. Oh yeah, well, okay, I'll do this one. This is not a case. This is a case of DB. Who suffered a heart attack basically while he was watching a basketball game. There was loss of blood supply to the brain and created an amnesia that can happen to you. And basically here you can see exactly the same thing that happens. DB lost memory for his experiences, but he retains memory of what he's like as a person. The interesting thing about this study was that Klein asked DB not just to remember his past, but also to project himself into the future by asking questions about what are some of the most important issues in the world over the next 10 years, or what are you going to do tomorrow? And it turns out DB can't answer questions about episodes of the past. What did you do? What did you do yesterday? Though he can answer questions about history. He retains knowledge of history that doesn't involve him. DB also has no idea what he's going to do tomorrow, even though when you ask him what are some of the most important issues over the next that we're going to see in this country over the next 10 years, he has a fairly good idea of what those kinds of things are going to be. Suggesting, interestingly, that the ability to imagine the future may be related to our ability to remember the past. And there's now a lot of interest in the idea that memory provides a basis for imagination, provides a basis for prediction. Okay, so that's the self as memory, episodic memories, autobiographical memories, if you will, and personal memories. There's one other aspect of the self as a knowledge structure that I just want to draw your attention to quickly, and that is because if you think about how we've characterized episodic self-knowledge, for now, there's kind of an unsatisfying quality to it. James Bartlett rescued a kitten. James Bartlett criticized the waitress. I was jittery. I liked the stranger, or whatever. These events seem to be disconnected with each other, and that's not our experience of our autobiographies. Our experiences of our autobiographical experience, our self-narrative, if you will, really consists of a story that has a kind of beginning and a middle and an end. And so, in addition to thinking about the mental representation of self as a concept, or as an image, or as a bunch of unrelated memories, we can actually begin to think of the self as the story that we tell about ourselves, as a kind of narrative, if you will. And the basic idea for this story model of knowledge and knowledge representation comes from Roger Schank, who's a cognitive scientist, does a lot of work in artificial intelligence, and Robert Abelson, the late Robert Abelson, who was a very important social psychologist, who argued, I'm not sure they're right about this, but this is their theory, that all human knowledge is based on stories that we construct around past experiences, and that when we have a new experience, we interpret this new experience in terms of old stories. And they argued that these stories, especially stories about ourselves, constitute what they call the remembered self. The general idea here being that your self is what you remember about yourself, but what you remember is not just isolated episodes, but rather a more or less coherent story. And they further suggested that that story memories that are shared within members of a particular group define particular social selves. When you go home and visit your parents for holidays, you probably don't tell them everything you've been doing since you've been on campus, right? And when you talk to your friends here, you probably don't tell them about every stupid thing you did as a junior high school student either. Those stories are shared within a particular social group, and the pattern of shared memories Schank and Abelson proposed will help us to define particular context-specific social selves. If you look around you, if you look at the kinds of books that are sold at Barnes & Noble and Amazon, you'll see that the self as a story is a very, very popular literary form these days. We're experiencing what has been called a memoir boom. If you look at best-selling books in Barnes & Noble, they're almost always memoirs. It's amazing how many people will buy a memoir by a person that they don't know anything about. Right? You want to read the memoir. And there's a whole history to this. Of course, in early fiction in the 18th and the 17th and 18th centuries, there were a lot of novels that were written in the first person. Okay, that's a very common literary device. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, most memoirs that were written were memoirs of other people. My time with Napoleon, or my time with Queen Victoria, or something like that. They were memoirs that talked about a person's experience with some other person. In the late 20th century, however, we began to experience in literature a kind of boom in the memoir as a literary format, and for the first time, we get a proliferation of memoirs in which people are writing about themselves. Tune in Oprah or something like that. In every other episode, I think she's interviewing somebody who's flogging some memoir on the market. This passion for memoir has actually influenced academic writing now. We're getting a lot more examples of first-person academic writing. Journal articles are always supposed to be dispassionate. 32 subjects were run in this particular experiment. Now people want to say, I ran 32 subjects in this experiment. Over in the departments of literature, whereas a previous generation of scholars would write about Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the new generation of literary scholars write about their reactions to Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. There's actually a new novel reviewed in the New York Times Book Review, a new memoir reviewed in the New York Times Book Review just this past week about a person's experiences reading Dostoevsky. Which is interesting. What's going on here is that there's kind of a self-performance, which suggests that there's more to autobiographical memory than simply a string of disconnected episodes. And we're coming up to the end of the hour here, but I just want to point out that so far, when we talk about episodic self-knowledge, when we talk about autobiographical memory, we haven't really captured autobiographical memory as the story that somebody tells about him or herself. Autobiographical memories are not just episodic memories, that is, knowledge about events that have a unique location in space and time. In the first place, autobiographical memories are autobiographical memories. They're about the self. They make explicit reference to the self. They make explicit reference to our own cognitive, emotional, and motivational states. Moreover, and this is what's missing in most accounts of autobiographical memory today, is that the self as story has a kind of Aristotelian plot structure. That is the kind of plot structure that would make Aristotle happy if you read the Poetics. First, these episodes are not disconnected from each other. They're arranged in a causal sequence. Our lives have a beginning and a middle and an end. Second, our episodes of experience are causally related to each other. One episode creates the possibility of another episode. And in our memories, we represent the causal links between one episode and another. And then finally, our autobiographical memories are not simply a hodgepodge of episodic memories. They're memories. We remember the things we remember largely because they are somehow relevant to our character, or to what Alfred Adler called our lifestyle. Our memories shape our personalities, but our personalities also shape our memories. And the things we remember in part to remind us of who we are, and the stories we tell about ourselves, we tell in part to communicate that self-knowledge, that self-awareness, that self-perception to other people. Okay? So, what does the self look like? From one point of view, the self looks like a concept. From another point of view, the self looks like an image. From a third point of view, the self looks like a memory structure. From the fourth point of view, the self is the story that we tell about ourselves. Next week, we'll turn from kind of disembodied cognitive psychology and take up the prospects for social cognitive neuropsychology and neuroscience. Thanks. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.